Hi, I'm Lars, and this is my land. In my land, I get to do pretty much whatever I want, and today, I want to talk about Ringo Starr, and you're gonna listen, because it's my land. And you're also gonna listen because nobody talks about Ringo. And here in my land, all four Beatles will get their day to shine. Actually, Ringo will get several days to shine. It's almost impossible to give them equal attention, but I'm going to do my best to try to right that wrong. And I'm going to do that by starting from the very beginning. Welcome to Annoying Memos land. Beepity beep beepity beep beep. So first off, reaction videos are dead. I didn't like doing them. I'm done with them. Second thing, I'm going to be sticking to mostly, if not all, Beatles videos until I'm ready to post Lost. If you have video requests, things that you'd like to see, things that you'd like to know more about, please let me know. Speaking of Lost, I've been working on a video essay series on the TV show Lost for so long now that if I don't mention it in every single video I do, I will get torqued like the home tree in Avatar. Now, before we go back to my land, I just wanted to let you know that I have the loudest chair in the universe, the driest eyes in the country, and that TV over there just likes to tilt whatever direction it feels like. I would apologize, but it's gonna happen again. Now let's go back to my land. Welcome back. Most of my information came from two books, Ringo with a Little Help by Seth Starr. Don't you judge me. It's not obsession, it's organization. Okay. Obviously, Starr, they're no relation here. If you didn't know Ringo Starr, that's not his last name. It's Starkey. Tune In by Mark Lewisohn. I would be using the extended volume that I have back there, but it's recovering from an injury right now. And I would have used The Beatles and the Historians to fact check that biography, but it's not even mentioned in here. In this book, it spends a lot of time talking about having equal coverage of each Beatle, and yet they didn't even mention this one. It has bibliography in the back. It's pretty good, so I'm pretty confident coming in with this. Other sources being just things that I've picked up and learned from various videos, interviews since April. So let's begin with Ringo's ancestral and parental history. That's right. I am starting from the very beginning. Ringo's family is from a part of Liverpool called Dingle. I think that this book has a map in it, or I could just show a map on the screen. Map on screen. He lived in a part of Liverpool called Dingle. It is right by the ports. It is a dangerous area, characterized, as Lewisohn describes it, by ugly manufacturing plants, gas stores, things like that. A tough, resilient people that, well, actually, tough and resilient, according to this book, and degenerate alcoholics, mostly unemployed or unemployable, according to this book. Both books say that the groups of people there banded together in difficult times, and that a lot of people were looking for work. In both sides of Ringo's family, they were workers, not degenerates. I mean, I don't think he used the word degenerate, but that's kind of the vibe you get. He said that there's malnourished children and people who can't take care of their kids and there's no need for education and yada yada, but also poverty does things like that. And I'm not trying to pick on Lewisohn, I promise. It's just that I think some of his phrasing, it's maybe a little overly critical. It's maybe a little tough, but that could also be because I am just a sensitive little baby bird. But it's okay to be that way as long as you know it, and I do. But I want to make clear some of the things that I think maybe are exaggerated or maybe aren't quite the way that they seem. And since I have two books here, I think it's just important to kind of show those contrasts, and maybe we can see where there's a little bit of scandal injected into it. But Lewisohn says that Ringo's family was Dingle through and through, and that actually is very true. Ringo's paternal grandfather's name was Johnny Starkey. I made postcards because it gets a little confusing, just in case if we can't follow. When I say we, I mean sometimes I need a little help. So his name was John Parkin, went by Johnny. He changed his last name to Starkey because his mom was hooking up with some guy that's last name was Starkey, and that was scandalous back in the day for living in sin. not a good look. And this was such a scandal that the Starkey family hid it from Ringo, and he only found out in the 1960s when he had someone trace his ancestry. So, But anyway, Johnny Starkey was the son of John Parkin, and then there was another John Parkin. This guy was born in 1865, and his family moved to Dingle in 1862, which means that Ringo's paternal family has been in Dingle since before the Emancipation Proclamation. And that sounds really impressive, but that's actually true for Ringo's maternal side as well. His family is really Dingle through and through. Johnny Starkey went on to marry Annie Bower, who went on to have 4 children, the second of which was named Richard Starkey. Richard Starkey went on to meet Elsie Gleaves, and they went on to have a child, Richard Starkey. So then they went on to have Little Richie and Big Richie, and that is Richie with a Y. So on the maternal side, Catherine Kitty Johnson had Dingle parents, but her father was born to a mariner who is from the Shetland Islands outside of Scotland, and her mother was from a place in Ireland. John and Kitty Gleave were married in 1914, and they had Elsie in October 1914. So scandal on this side too, guys. Elsie is the oldest, obviously. She had 7 younger siblings, but only 4 of them survived infancy. Elsie's dad fought in the Great War, which I'm sure was tough. Elsie was a caretaker for her grandmother from an early age. Many people believe that that started in childhood, which is also kind of a difficult thing to go through. She left school at 14 and took whatever job she could, including working at Cooper's Bakery. I forgot to mention something a little earlier. Richard Starkey was a confectioner at Cooper's Bakery, which was quite a profession to have at this time, and that's where he met Elsie. They were married in October 1936. He was 23 and she was 22. They moved out of the Starkey family home and into 9 Madron Street. Elsie got pregnant about 4 weeks after the war was declared, and Ringo came into this world a week after his due date on July 7th, 1940. He was 10 pounds, and he was born at 9 Madron Street because going to the hospital was expensive, prohibitively expensive, whether it be just a few hours or overnight. So it was much more common to have babies at home. And only 58 days later, the Germans began bombing Liverpool. This is called the Liverpool Blitz. I spent a good amount of time researching this because I think it shapes the Beatles in a way that we really need to understand and don't talk about enough. The Liverpool Blitz began August 28th with 3 days straight of bombing, and it stopped on August 31st, and then over the next several years, Liverpool was regularly bombed. At first, there were 50 air raids on the city within a 3-month period. That is crazy. This is the first year of Ringo's life where all of this stuff is happening. I can't imagine the fear and then the world of normalizing it, because you have to normalize what you're living through or else you just can't accept it. And what we know about Elsie and Richard is that they were really hard workers. Elsie took any job she could. So she would be a barmaid, she would scrub steps, she would be a homemaker or a nanny or a seamstress. She would do anything. She was the odd jobs lady of Madron Street. And a little bit of war probably wouldn't have stopped her from working. 2 years this continued, and the final bomb was dropped on Liverpool in January 1942. There's no way for me to ever imagine or to be able to understand what living through that might be like, and having that happen for the first year and a half of your life, what that might be like and how parenting might have changed, all kinds of things. So those are things that I like to keep in mind when I'm thinking about the Beatles and how that might shape some of their behavior. I found a clip of a BBC sound engineer climbing up a watchtower, and he took audio. This is what he said. St. Luke's Church, that's a big church at the top of Bold Street. That's just a shell. That's been burnt out. The water mains went and they couldn't do anything. The firemen couldn't fight the fire. They had no water. Liverpool was targeted in a way that is excessive. It was the second most bombed place in the UK behind London. And there's actually this quote in this book that kind of pissed me off. So this part is talking about in 1945, a few years after the Blitz had stopped, after the war was over. Much of the Liverpool in which all these people lived was in ruins, the city fathers having made distressingly few efforts to bandage its open wounds during the 4 post-Blitz years. Certainly nothing like as much as Britain's other bombed cities were doing. And that bothered me because they were probably going through a lot more confusion because they were continuously a target. So they were never really free until the war was over. I don't know how much reconstruction efforts would be priority for Liverpool at that point. It just seemed a little overly critical. I don't know, man. And actually, in the middle of the war, 3 years after Ringo was born, Richard Starkey left the family. So Elsie started raising Ringo alone. Ringo said something that was kind of interesting. Let me see. Ringo would later say that he had no tangible memories of his father and thought badly of Richard Sr. after being brainwashed by Elsie's stories about her ex-husband. I haven't found that interview yet, but I think that's important to note that he said that. When Ringo was 11, Elsie married Harry Graves, and he said that he learned gentleness from Harry. Harry actually worked at the local U.S. Air Force Base, so he had access to more American comics and things like that, which made Ringo and his Davy Patterson very popular. Those two were inseparable for more than 10 years. Ringo's home life was mostly positive. It was cold where they lived. They had running water, which was a big luxury, but it was cold water and they had to go outside to use the restroom. Davy actually said that they usually didn't have toilet paper and they would have to cut up squares of newspaper. So that's just a tidbit that I'm sure you wanted to know, right? Ringo began school at St. Silas Primary, which was close by on Pengwern Street. His first teacher at St. Silas is named Enid Williams, and she takes credit for introducing Ringo to the drums. But that's not the way that other people remember it, so just hold on to that tidbit. She said that Ringo was delicate and coddled. I think that might have something to do with his sickliness as a child. When Ringo was 6, he developed peritonitis, which was very serious. In fact, he was rushed to Royal Children's Infirmary, which is also known as Myrtle Street Children's Hospital, which is what I'm going to be calling it because that's what it was more Googled as. That's the rule setter, I guess. And the doctors, as they operated on Ringo, told Elsie 3 times overnight that Ringo was going to die. But Ringo pulled through, and he spent the next 10 weeks in a coma-like state. And then he was in the hospital for 10 months. When he finally returned, he couldn't go back to school. He had another 12 months of recuperation before he could return to St. Silas. During that time, he actually learned how to read from his babysitter, who was only 3 years older than him. Her name was Maggie McGuire, and he learned how to read and he learned how to spell phonetically. She taught him using Chambers primary readers, and the first book he ever read was called Dobbin the Horse. When he went back to school, he earned the nickname Lazarus because he was raised from the dead, which I think is super badass. And because he was kind of itty and a little delicate, he learned to rely on a sharp wit to get through times, and he made friends with the biggest boy in the class because it was good to have a big friend when you are the smallest kid. Ringo, Davy, and their friend Brian Briscoe would do anything for money, which included selling off comics, joining choirs, anything else. They loved going to the movies, watching westerns, and pretending that they were Zorro. Gene Autry performing South of the Border was the first song that struck Ringo, and it happened during this time. He said that it gave him shivers, and he called Gene Autry his hero. The first time Ringo saw something on TV, he was 13 years old. It was Queen Elizabeth's coronation, and it was through the window of a TV store. Even though Richard Starkey had left Ringo and Elsie, his family lived nearby and were very involved in Ringo's upbringing. Johnny Starkey was a professional boilermaker, and he wound up making a toy locomotive. It was so heavy it could barely move, but Ringo said that they would play in it and it would just steam up. He said it was the coolest toy he ever had. I wrote in my notes, is there a picture of this? And then in the next page, it explains that cameras were so rare and you would have to pay to get photographed. So I was like, well, I guess not. But it would have been cool, right? Davy says that Ringo's first drum was a tom-tom that he got from West Africa. They would go into the fields and they would try to find rabbits and bang on the drum to bring the rabbits out of the hole. And he was like, it obviously didn't work, but that's what he claims was Ringo's first drum. One time, Davey, Brian, and Ringo stole some of Elsie's money, and they had 10 shillings. They went down to the shops, they rode the escalator like 10 times, and they went up to a cafe and ordered breakfast twice. They also went and tried to buy a knife, but the sales lady wouldn't give them a knife, but they bought an axe. So then they went to a park and they tried to chop down trees, and they were unsuccessful, but that was their big day out. Even though Ringo was kind of a delicate little guy and doing weird shit like trying to chop down trees, he was tough, resilient, and he got on with it, according to the Michael Starr book. At this point, Ringo started school at Dingle Vale Secondary Modern, but he wasn't there for too long before he got sick again. He was sick with tuberculosis, but the stigma against it was so strong that they actually said he had pleurisy, I'm pretty sure. At least that's what they said, so he could escape the stigma of having TB. Initially, he went back to Myrtle Street Children's Hospital. After a few months, he was transferred to Heswell's Children's Hospital, where he stayed for nearly 2 years. And this is where he definitively learned about the drums. During his time there, they didn't have actual like education for the kids, but they had classes come in so they would learn about crafts and art and music. Ringo has to tell the story all the time, but he says that there was a teacher that would come into the hospital. She would hand out instruments, and then she had a little pointer and she would point to which instrument it was, and you'd hit your instrument. He wouldn't play if he didn't get the drum, so that's how he started getting into drums. He started making drumsticks out of cotton bobbins and banging on whatever he could. He wasn't even supposed to leave the hospital yet, but he convinced his family to jump him out before his 15th birthday, and that's when he finally came home. He was going to come back to St. Silas Primary, but they said that they had no record of him ever attending the school. Yet, later on, they went on to charge people to sit at Ringo Starr's desk, so okay. But Ringo never really had any intention of going back to school, so he didn't. His interest in music was really compiling at this time, and he saw Johnny Ray perform at the Empire, and that really sparked his interest in music. This is kind of a bummer, but after basically walking to school together every single day, Davey joined the Navy at 15 years old, and they basically never talked again. Ringo took a few jobs over the next year or so, and he was a messenger for the railroad, and then he worked on a pleasure barge as a bartender, but he lost that job after showing up hungover and mouthing off to his boss, so he got fired. And then he got an apprenticeship at Henry Hunt & Son through connections through Harry, so his family was a little nervous, like this guy is a little too focused on the drums, but luckily he didn't screw this up. He took an apprenticeship as a fitter, where he learned how to make gymnasium equipment, which was like the balance beams and the bars. During that time, he was paid $38 and $6. He was making $50.96 per week. That's in 2022 dollars. So not a lot of money. Definitely below the poverty line here. But he worked hard. He heard Lonnie Donegan play Rock Isle Line, and he really learned about Skiffle, which was a musical movement that started from homemade instruments. You'd have a tea chest and a string making a standing bass, and you'd have an acoustic guitar and a washboard for percussion. Sometimes people would be blowing into bottles, and that was Skiffle. So, of course, Ringo started getting into it. He and his friend Bob Hardy almost moved to Texas when he was 18. They wanted to live near Lightnin' Hopkins, which was another one of Ringo's heroes. In 1955, Ringo purchased his first drum, and it was a one-sided bass, but Harry, for $240, bought Ringo a 25-year-old used drum kit. It wasn't great, but Ringo was so excited about it and so proud of it, which was good timing because this is about the time where he got involved with Eddie Miles. And Eddie Miles was a neighbor and a friend, but he was also a co-worker at Henry Hunt. So they started a band. It started out as the Eddie Miles Band, and then it turned into the Eddie Clayton Skiffle Group, and that band got pretty popular. I even found a photo of them, which is hard to do. They played at the Cavern several times in December 57 and early 1958, so that's pretty cool. Ringo also had a friend, Roy Trafford, and they became very close and did almost everything together. Roy says that he taught Ringo how to drum with the brushes. That's the only time I've ever heard that. Those two were completely inseparable. They took dance classes at Skellin's dance school so they could be good dancers and made them more popular with the ladies. They regularly listened to Radio Luxembourg and Alan Freed's Saturday Night Show. In the summer of 1958, Ringo went ahead and borrowed $46 from his grandpa Johnny, and he put it toward a $100 drum kit. His grandpa reluctantly and jokingly gave it to him, and Ringo diligently paid it back £1 a week out of his paycheck. At this point, he and his friends wanted to differentiate their look, so they started dressing like teddy boys, but also because Dingle is a dangerous area and gangs were just a part of it. Ringo joined a gang. They all kind of had goofy names. None of them were serious, but honestly, some of the stuff that he talked about is brutal, okay? In this book, it says that Ringo was not a good fighter, but he was a fast runner, but he had also been beaten up by his friends, and he had seen people, what did he say? He got beat up even by his own guys. He saw people be stabbed. He saw eyes get gouged out and people beaten with hammers. So not exactly for the faint of heart for a not serious gang. Some people would sew razors into their lapels, so if you grabbed them, you'd cut your hands. And Ringo never did that, but he did fasten his belt into a weapon. So he sharpened all the points on his belt and his belt buckle so he could cut people with them if necessary. Holy God, Jesus Christ. Around this point, music took over. He left the gang and he was really focused on music. He dated a few girls, and I might talk about them more in a different video, but I don't know. He dated Patricia Davis and he dated Geraldine McGovern. Shortly after Ringo's 18th birthday, he bought a white and red standard Vanguard from a drummer, Johnny Hutch, and this was a big deal because as a drummer, not having a car was a royal pain. He needed to ask people for rides because he had to haul his kit wherever he went. One time he actually took a bus, and he said that he had to run with 3 cases back and forth as fast as he could so his stuff wouldn't get stolen. So getting the car was a huge deal, and I was super pumped to find the photos of him in the car. Now, the Eddie Clayton Skiffle group disbanded in 1958. It didn't really matter because at this point, Skiffle was on its way out, and that was fine because Ringo was already preoccupied with what was to become rock and roll. And that's where we're going to stop for today. I am so pumped about this series on Ringo. I don't know if it's going to be like next video, or if it's just going to be more sporadic, but I'm excited to talk about him. I hope you liked it too. I would absolutely love it if you would like and subscribe and all that jazz. And y'all come back now, you hear? Bye.
My sweet Lord. My Lord. My Lord. But it takes so long, my Lord. My sweet Lord.